We're going to resume our program. This is the afternoon session, and one that is probably most interesting and provocative and talked about and contemporary, uh, with topics that are on everybody's plate every day. The committee that put this program together actually uh, planned this very carefully. It will be moderated by the journalist, as he was referred to today, that you've seen ask a lot of questions. He is a member of the Palestine Center Committee and a gentleman that I've known here since the early 70s. Mr. Saeed Ariqat, one of the most capable Arab journalists in Washington, D.C., in my experience, and I've been here in Washington for, or at least associated with Washington for 53 years. And I'm proud to say that. I've known Saeed, and he has done an excellent job. The panel is in your program. The bios of the speakers are in the pamphlet, and the topics also are, as you can see, are very simple, very easy to articulate. Only Jerusalem, Gaza, and the PDS. So this is a tall order for this panel. Saeed, it's all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Subhi, and thank you everyone for being here. We definitely had two wonderful panels earlier today. We had a dynamic and a very energetic panel that went through the idea of the only way to end really the difficulties, the adversity that the Palestinians face was really through the undoing of Zionism as a colonial project. And then, of course, we talked about, we went through the elusive presence of the Israeli left and so on, and where it is and so on. And then the path forward. And then we went through, in the second panel, as just, as we all have participated in the panel, we went through the Bantustans as as something to preclude sovereignty. We talked about Khalid addressed shared sovereignty and so on, and Sam very capably talked about the media's role and how you can hold their feet to the fire and the path forward. For this afternoon, as Dr. Subhi said, we have issues that are really a tall order. Jerusalem, Gaza, and Bds. Jerusalem is definitely shrinking under the feet of its Palestinian inhabitants. They're being forced out of it. It's becoming suffocated. Gaza has been termed by the United Nations as, come 2020, it will be unlivable. It is probably unlivable now. And BDS is really a glimmer of hope around which we can rally. So it can become, in a way, or in combination of others, as a rallying cry around which we can organize. And we have excellent panelists for this panel. We have Ambassador Feda Abdelhady-Nasser, who represent the State of Palestine at the Security Council and at the General Assembly and its main committees, particularly the Special Political and Decolonization Committee, the fourth committee, with specific focus on the issue of UNRWA. UNRWA, as you know, is being threatened a great deal by the Israeli lobby and others to undo because of its service for the Palestinians. And then we have, among many other things, I will not go into the details, then we have Dr. Lawrence Davidson is a professor emeritus of history at Westchester University in Pennsylvania. He's the author of 5 books, includes America's Palestine, 2001, and Foreign Policy in 2009. He has also published numerous articles on Palestine, Israel, U.S. foreign policy, among others. And then last but not least, we have Dr. Sara Roy, is a senior research scholar at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, specializing in Palestinian economy, Palestinian Islamism, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. At Harvard University, Dr. Roy is also co-chair of Middle East Seminar, jointly sponsored by the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, and co-chair of the Middle East Forum at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. So with that, please begin.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here among all of the distinguished presenters, participants, and organizers of the Palestine Center's annual conference. I've been asked today to reflect on the subject of Jerusalem. There are, of course, limitless dimensions to the subject of Jerusalem: historical, religious, political, strategic, cultural, and otherwise, across the centuries. However, today I want to focus on the legal dimension as concerns the applicability of international law to the city, specifically in the context of United Nations resolutions since Israel's occupation of East Jerusalem in 1967. This city, once the vibrant heart of Palestinian life, a tapestry of our heritage and civilization, home to 3 monotheistic religions and glorious holy sites and antiquities, has been abused and pillaged by a brutal foreign occupation bent on the violent dispossession, displacement, and denigration of its Palestinian inhabitants, and on the erasure of its legal status, character, and history through a series of unlawful policies and measures in grave violation of international law and UN resolutions over decades. That Israel's actions have aimed at altering the facts on the ground, including the demography of Palestine, as was discussed today, by ethnically cleansing the city's population, Palestinian population, and diminishing, if not deleting, its Palestinian, Arab, Muslim, and Christian identities, is undeniable, as is the colonial, annexationist nature of this 50-year occupation. I will posit, however, that international law, in particularly the UN Charter, international humanitarian law as embodied in the 4th Geneva Convention, and international legislation and interpretation of the law regarding the question of Palestine, as reflected in UN resolutions, has helped protect East Jerusalem and maintain its status as occupied territory, in which Israel is not in any way considered the sovereign in the city, despite declarations and actions to the contrary, but is considered the occupying power, according to which its actions are assessed and deemed to be unlawful. Conference participants are all well aware of Israel's countless violations against our people and land, including in East Jerusalem. So in the interest of time, I will not go into full detail. But it is essential to consider the extent of these crimes as we reflect on the law and protections it provides. The most glaring of Israel's violations in Jerusalem include, but are not limited to, the construction of settlements and the wall in and around the city, which along with checkpoints have intensified its isolation, severing it from its natural Palestinian environments and the rest of the Palestinian population, and fragmenting the Palestinian land. Transfer of hundreds of thousands of Israeli settlers to the city, with thousands implanted in entirely Palestinian neighborhoods, including in old city quarters. Seizure and demolition of Palestinian homes and properties, causing forced displacement of Palestinian families, in addition to the revocation of residency rights and eviction of thousands of Palestinian Jerusalemites. The prolonged closure of Palestinian political and cultural institutions in the city, provocations, inflammatory rhetoric, and incitement by Israeli government officials from the Prime Minister on down, and by extremist settlers and Jewish zealots targeting Al-Haram al-Sharif in particular, and stoking tensions and religious sensitivities, excavations near and around holy sites undermining their sanctity and stability, and collective punishment of Jerusalem's Palestinian population with constant arrests and detentions of civilians and military raids of homes and neighborhoods, denial of so-called permits for building housing and infrastructure, including schools and health facilities, and the ghettoization of the Palestinian community and suffocation of the economy, including through imposition of severe movement restrictions on the rest of the Palestinian population to access the city that was once the country's commercial and cultural heart, causing high unemployment, poverty, and a deep sense of despair, especially among our youth, and as evident in the desolation of the city's refugee camps and neighborhoods, including, for example, the Shu'afat camp. These policies have been carried out by every single Israeli government since 1967 in grave breach of the Fourth Geneva Convention, Additional Protocol 1, and since 2008, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and in violation of countless Security Council and General Assembly resolutions and the 2004 advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. From my perspective of over 2 decades at the UN, international law has, in the absence of a just solution, preserved Palestinian rights in the city and averted a fait accompli, in spite of all of Israel's illegal schemes and measures aimed at negating Palestinian rights and very existence in East Jerusalem and creating an artificial Jewish majority there in order to solidify its annexation plans since 1967. Of course, it is true that the status of the entire city remains unresolved. Regrettably, however, the law was unable to protect Jerusalem from Israel's seizure of the western part of the city in 1948 in contempt of the General Assembly's designation of Jerusalem as a corpus separatum in accordance with Resolution 181, by which Palestine was unjustly, unlawfully, and forcibly partitioned 70 years ago. As Israel went on to seize lands far beyond the partition, amounting to 78% of Palestine, the 1949 Armistice Line would later become the 1967 border, or Green Line. And that territory has been designated for decades now as the geographical space for future Palestinian independence and sovereignty as per the two-state solution. And here I acknowledge, as was exchanged during the discussion today, that there are differing views on the two-state solution versus the one-state solution or any other solution. However, the fact remains that up until the present, this solution is the primary component of the consensus international position, the position shared by states in the United Nations regarding the parameters of a just solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And this compromise was accepted by the PLO nearly 30 years ago in the context of the 1988 Declaration of Independence of the State of Palestine. The two-state solution thus remains central to numerous UN resolutions on Palestine to the present day until a determination is made otherwise. And it can with a change in strategy, but we are not there. To further respond to concerns in this regard, I'd like to quickly highlight an assertion recently made by the executive director of Al-Shabaka, Ms. Nadia Hijab, that despite the perceived unfairness, unviability, and impracticality of the two-state solution, we must not let go of the 1967 line or in any way assist Israel in negating that line or the international legal provisions applicable to this situation of occupation, only facilitating Israel's attempts to normalize and sanctify its conquest of territory. As she states, quote, "Despite all of its maneuvering, Israel has not yet been able to erase the Green Line altogether and legalize the permanent acquisition of the occupied Palestinian territory, even though the international community has not held Israel accountable in an effective way. It will not sign off on Israel's colonization project and give it legitimacy in the eyes of the world," end quote. She emphasizes this as central to the importance of UN Security Council Resolution 2334, which was adopted last December, which, among other things, reaffirmed the illegality of Israel's settlement campaign and annexation measures in the Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, stressing that, quote, "This is why Israel's response to 2334 was so angry. Its ability to erase the Green Line took a major hit." Indeed, regardless of Israel's insistence that the entirety of Jerusalem is its so-called united and eternal capital, the fact remains that its 1980 annexation of East Jerusalem remains unrecognized by nearly every country in the world. Israel's presence in East Jerusalem, again, remains that of an occupying power, and its control and actions continue to be considered unlawful. This was explicitly reiterated by the Security Council as recently as 2016, when in Resolution 2334, it underscored, quote, "It will not recognize any changes to the 4 June 1967 lines, including with regard to Jerusalem," and called on states to, quote, "distinguish in their relevant dealings between the territory of the State of Israel and the territories occupied since 1967. In this way, international law, as enshrined in UN resolutions, has preserved East Jerusalem's status as occupied and as an integral part of the Palestinian territory. These resolutions have prevented also the granting of legitimacy to Israel's illegal measures and safeguarded the city's holy sites, including the historic status quo at al-Haram al-Sharif, in place for decades, even preceding the occupation. Moreover, the law has served to protect Palestinian rights in and to the city, including in regards of their national rights and aspirations to independence, as the territory occupied in 1967 has been recognized by the UN General Assembly as the patrimony of the Palestinian people, on which they should be enabled to exercise their right to self-determination and freedom in the context of an historic compromise aimed at ensuring a just and lasting peace. So far from being simply words on paper, as some critics tend to refer to UN resolutions, they are actually significant to shaping global views, reinforcing long-standing positions despite the passage of time and Israel's feverish attempts to alter the facts on the ground, especially in Jerusalem, and ensure the applicability of the law to the question of Palestine in all aspects until a just solution is achieved. We witnessed invocation of these long-standing principles in response to hostile actions in Jerusalem again this past July. Provocations at Al-Aqsa Mosque galvanized Palestinians in peaceful protests by the thousands, underscoring Jerusalem's centrality to our cause and its sensitivity to all Palestinian, Muslim, and Christian, religious and secular, young and old, and also once again highlighting the legendary resilience of our people and their readiness to stand firm against the occupation's crimes. These events also led to mobilization by the governments of Palestine, as well as Jordan in its role as custodian of the holy sites, along with other regional and international partners, intensifying pressure on Israel through messaging that such actions would not be tolerated and must be ceased. Similarly, the threats of the new U.S. administration to move the American embassy to East Jerusalem, an incendiary pledge made by one candidate after another in every presidential election campaign, in contradiction of long-standing U.S. policy not recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the city, triggered a flurry of diplomatic and political activity earlier this year to prevent such a move, cautioning of its dangers and reaffirming international legislation in this regard, the majority supported by the U.S., or at least not vetoed by it. As stressed earlier, this could be noted in the effects of the latest resolution on the matter, Security Council Resolution 2334, which unequivocally reaffirmed the prohibition of the acquisition of territory by force, as well as other applicable rules of international law, contrary to Israel's constant efforts to divorce the issue entirely from the law and entirely from international engagement. As you will recall, Resolution 2334 was adopted at the end of last year, at the end of the Obama presidency, after an 8-year dry spell in the Security Council due to U.S. opposition that has historically shielded Israel from censure and accountability, inevitably fostering further impunity rather than a cessation of its crimes. Again, to the cynics, yes, Resolution 2334 is far less than we need or deserve, but is what was possible and is important, for we can only imagine what the situation might be in the absence of such a resolution and how much more exploitative Israel would be in its attempts to blur the lines and impose its annexation schemes under an administration like the current one or any other in power. These resolutions therefore remain of immense value, sustaining long-held legal positions rather than arbitrary positions as per the sentiment of the day, and remain meaningful despite repetition over the decades and despite the lack of political will to, up until now, enforce the law. In this regard, many may not know that the General Assembly annually adopts a resolution on Jerusalem. That resolution reaffirms that, quote, all legislative and administrative measures and actions taken by Israel, the occupying power, which have altered or purported to alter the character and status of the holy city of Jerusalem, in particular the so-called Basic Law on Jerusalem and the proclamation of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, are null and void, end quote, and must be rescinded, ceased and rescinded. That resolution receives overwhelming majority support to this day in the General Assembly and will be voted on again by the Assembly on the 30th of November. Security Council resolutions on Jerusalem are equally explicit, with numerous resolutions adopted since 1948. At least 13 of those resolutions have been adopted since 1967, with specific reference to the situation in Jerusalem. As early in the occupation as 1968, the Council declared in Resolution 252, quote, all legislative and administrative measures taken by Israel, which tend to change the legal status of Jerusalem, are invalid and cannot change that status, end quote, and called on Israel to rescind all such measures and to desist forthwith from taking any further actions changing the status of Jerusalem. Such pronouncements would be repeated in subsequent resolutions, refined and strengthened as Israel's noncompliance and malintent became more obvious. In Resolution 298 in 1971, for example, the Council went on to deplore, quote, the failure of Israel to respect the previous resolutions adopted by the United Nations concerning the measures and actions by Israel purporting to affect the status of the city of Jerusalem, end quote, including expropriation of land and properties, transfer of populations, and legislation aimed at incorporation of the occupied section, all of which the Council said are invalid and cannot change that status. By 1979, in Resolution 446, the Council also explicitly determined that Israel's policy of colonizing the Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, was unlawful, and called on Israel to rescind all such measures. Later, in Resolution 672 in 1990, 1073 in 1996, and 1322 in 2000, the Council addressed developments regarding Al-Aqsa Mosque and Al-Haram al-Sharif using that specific terminology, which is also used by the General Assembly to this day, as opposed to current trends in the United States and Europe adopting the Israeli terminology of Temple Mount to refer to this site alongside its Islamic Arab name. In this regard, we all know that words matter, and that their distortion, including of names, can constitute the first step towards altering history, identity, and status, thus making such articulations in international legislation significant. In 1980, the Security Council also called not just upon the government of Israel, but also the people of Israel to cease on an urgent basis the establishment, construction, and planning of settlements in the Arab territories occupied by Israel since 1967, and called for and stressed the overriding necessity to end the prolonged occupation of Arab territories occupied by Israel since 1967, including Jerusalem. 36 years later, this call was made again by the Council to end the occupation. Indeed, all of these decisions, over 5 decades, sound as though they could have been made yesterday, as all violations continue to the present day, compelling the Council to make these calls over and over again to no avail. So some may ask then, how then has UN legislation helped to remedy the situation, since it has clearly only worsened as a result of the occupation's crimes and blatant disrespect for UN authority. I would posit that the problem is not in UN resolutions, but rather in their lack of implementation. And here lies the gap between international law and the reality on the ground. And this gap between the law and its implementation is at the core of this continuing injustice. There is a harsh disconnect between the legal positions adopted by states and actual measures being taken by states to uphold the law in order to hold Israel accountable for its violations and compel its compliance. To remedy that gap between legislation and implementation, there are respective roles that must be played by diplomats, governments, civil society, and activists and the public, each role reinforcing of the other. As diplomats, we use the political, legal, diplomatic tools available to us to pursue this day in, day out, year in, year out, not just on the day or two we might make headlines in any given year. And we continue to do so. Although the difficulties and setbacks are immense, we cannot relent in this regard, for despite prevalent misperceptions, UN resolutions, ICJ advisory opinions, and such clear affirmations of our people's rights do not happen simply by the UN's good grace or the international community's unconditional care and generosity towards Palestine. This has been painfully proven by history. If Palestine's representatives don't give voice to our people's plight and continuously draw attention to the occupation's violations, if we don't advocate for our rights, if we don't draft and negotiate each and every word and line and lobby for each and every vote, then these resolutions would likely cease to exist, and we would lose an important part of our struggle in the realm of the international arena and international legitimacy. And I had a little bit more to say, but I will conclude in order to give enough time to the rest of the participants.
Sit down.
Oh, sorry.
Hello, my name is Lawrence Davidson, and I'm going to talk to you about BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and I'm going to try to do that. You bet. Yep. My premise here is that boycott, divestment, and sanctions, otherwise known as BDS, actually works. And when I say it works, I mean it begins to raise the cost to the Israelis of ignoring the otherwise position of states in theory in condemnation of their racist and colonialist behavior. So again, if we've got international law, we have, there's this disconnect between the law and its enforcement. We've got to have a way of raising the cost of violating the law. And at least in the West, the BDS seems to be one of those ways, okay? If you go to the website of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, you can find a list of 200 recent victories in the U.S. falling within the boycott and divestment categories. Sanctions, of course, are a little harder to come by, but they're working on it, okay? Success in this particular area has, of course, generated fierce resistance, fierce pushback by the Zionists, and to the degree that they're pushed back, one can assume that that's a sort of a way of measuring the success of the BDS. The Israeli government, according to a article in the Huffington Post, the Israeli government has reportedly committed tens of millions of dollars, one whole government ministry, and elements of its military and security intelligence assets to fight against the BDS. Okay, And of course, there's this infamous statement by the Israeli Minister of Transport, Yisrael Katz, who said, well, why don't we just target the BDS leaders for civil elimination? Okay, so is there any? We don't have any metal detectors at the door. Okay, actually, this reaction, okay, reflects the fact that the Zionists have lost the public debate when it comes to their behavior towards the Palestinians. They've lost the public debate, okay? And so, having done so, they then retreat, for the most part, and focus their efforts on public officials, on corporate boards, on university boards of trustees, where they can apply either ideological or financial influence in order to compensate for their inability to win a debate over these issues. Okay, it's the direction that this influence is taking the modern world that I think has to be recognized, okay? So Israel, for instance, Israel is a society that should be seen as a product of pre-World War II colonial era. And I think the brouhaha over the Balfour Declaration, is one demonstration of the fact that Israel, even in terms of how it sees its legitimacy, goes back to a pre-modern colonial era. So the Balfour Declaration, for instance, is an imperial and colonial document, okay, in which a European power promised a non-European parcel of land to another European people, and essentially did so, to quote Edward Said, in flat disregard of both the presence and wishes of the native majority resident in the territory. That flat disregard was in perfect harmony, perfectly accepted by Europeans and Westerners generally within a colonial cultural context. All right. So, for instance, if you look at the debate within the war cabinet, the British war cabinet, nobody challenged the British representative of an empire to do this. I mean, they had logistical and tactical objections, some of them, but nobody said, "Oh, you don't have the right to do that." Okay. And as a consequence, you get this European settler community implanted in what was at that time the midst of 700,000 Arabs. Given the end for which the Zionists pushed, that is, given the exclusive ethno-religious ends of that particular settler community, to create a state first and foremost for one group only, overt racist policies and laws were absolutely inevitable. Absolutely inevitable. You can't do it any other way. You can't take one group, okay, put them down in the midst of an alien group, and have that one group's goal being an exclusive community for it alone, and not end up with ethnic cleansing, racist laws. It's just, you can't do it any other way, okay? But within a pre-World War II colonial environment, nobody in the West would question it. Or I wouldn't say no one, but most people would not, okay? However, today, things have changed. Today, most of us understand that these behaviors and these beliefs are morally reprehensible and that their consequences should be remedied. And so, to the extent that modern people share this sense of moral repulsion, the world has really changed. Okay? Today we live in a post-colonial environment wherein imperialism is thought by most people to be a negative thing of the past. That has real consequences. That means that Israel and the Zionist project are anachronisms. Okay, much like white South Africa was an anachronism. All products of a previous era. All right? And it follows from that fact that for Israel to be truly accepted into the modern world, one of two things has to happen. Either Israel has to change. And when I say it has to change, I say it has to become a non-colonial settler state. It has to give up Zionism. Or two, the world must revert back to an acceptance of at least some of the colonial practices of the 19th century. Now, you would think that choosing the anti-racist option there, and therefore taking seriously the pressuring of Israel, seriously pressuring that state, as was done with South Africa, okay, to fundamentally change, you would think that that option would be the obvious choice of today's statesmen. But it's not. It's not. There is now an ongoing effort, and I'm sure we all can recognize it if we think about it. There's an ongoing effort, we might call it an updated Zionist project, to move the world backward so that it accepts some of the racist past practices. This is done by an attack two ways. An attack on international law to the extent that it tries to protect human rights. And this attack on international law in respect to human rights is very ironic because a lot of that law is a product of a reaction to Nazi crimes against Jews. The Zionists are attacking this anyway. Okay? So there's an effort to push the world back so that it accepts these colonial practices by attacking international law as it pertains to human rights, and two, an attack on the United Nations and its efforts to protect human rights for Palestinians specifically. What this means is that the BDS is part of a struggle to prevent this retrograde movement. It's a tactic to defend modernity, to defend modern decency, all right? So it's part of an effort. It's not the only thing that can be done, but it's part of an effort to help save the international law, the integrity of international law, human rights, civil rights, the rule of law, really, for all of us. Here in the United States, the right to wage this struggle in the form of boycott and divestment is wrapped up in an effort to protect our constitutional right to free speech. And this is all because BDS has become successful, okay? It's got the potential to do to Israel what the same kind of movement did to South Africa. And that's why the Israelis are so uptight about it, okay? And because it has this potential, Israel and its surrogates in the US and Europe are willing to destroy or undermine the very laws and rights that help uphold civilization as we know it in a post-colonial scenario, in a post-colonial era, okay? So BDS is more than just a tactic. It's like a symbol of modernity. And as goes BDS, so goes the First Amendment, so goes international human rights, civil rights, and what have you. That's why we all have to, protect and support the BDS. I give all my extra minutes to Sara Roy.
Well, first of all, I want to thank the members of, or the organizers of the Palestine Center for inviting me. I'm very glad to be back. Perhaps it's fitting that I should be the last speaker, since I'm going to take the conversation down to the ground level in Gaza. And I'm going to speak to you from a piece that's soon to be published, which I wrote based on a trip I made to Gaza a little over a year ago. And this is an accounting of what, most importantly, of what people told me, what they wanted me to communicate, what I saw, and what I came to understand. It was my last day in Gaza. I was in a UN bus with several UNRWA employees leaving for the Erez checkpoint at Gaza's border with Israel. This was after a very intensive week of interviews. We were driving along Omar al-Mukhtar Street, one of the main commercial streets in Gaza City. The bus stopped at a red light at a very busy intersection, and I was staring out the window and noticed below me, in the lane next to ours, an old man in a car. He held some pita bread in his hand, and he was attempting to make a sandwich with some other kind of food that I didn't recognize. Suddenly, the old man looked up from his sandwich and motioned to a young boy of no more than 11 or 12 years who was standing on the sidewalk, peddling packs of cigarettes he held in a big wooden tray. The tray hung like a millstone around the boy's neck, the weight too much to bear for such a small child. The young boy approached the old man, and a brief exchange ensued. I assumed the old man was going to buy a pack of cigarettes, but instead, the young boy handed him 2 individual cigarettes, which it seemed was all he could afford. The old man paid the boy, and then, in a gesture that surprised the youngster, the man threw half of his pita sandwich into the boy's tray. He scurried away, and I kept staring at the old man, thinking about his small but generous act of kindness. As our bus began to move, I looked up, and I saw the young boy at the corner of the intersection voraciously eating his half of the pita sandwich, and he ate with a hunger that stunned me. So much has been written about Gaza, her economic decline and political dysfunction, and the unending predictions of another imminent war. Why even talk about Gaza, a friend of mine asked rhetorically. But that, of course, is not the right question. The far more relevant and difficult question, especially now, is how is one to talk about Gaza? And what follows is my attempt at an answer. And again, I'm just going to read excerpts. We are people who can float in an inch of water. Gaza is in a state of humanitarian shock, due primarily to Israel's intensified closure or blockade, now in its 11th year, and disgracefully supported by the US, the EU, and Egypt, among other countries. The blockade, coupled with 3 assaults in 6 years, has created severe hardship, as you all know. It has ruined Gaza's economy, largely by ending normal trade relations upon which Gaza's tiny economy depends. Gaza, historically a place of trade and commerce, has very low levels of production at present, largely reduced to one common denominator, and that is consumption. An easing of Israel's restrictions on certain agricultural exports and limited industrial exports over the last 3 years has eased conditions slightly, but has failed to rehabilitate Gaza's productive sectors. Gaza's deliberately and consciously planned and successfully executed, has left almost half the labor force without any means to earn a living. Unemployment, especially youth unemployment, was the defining factor in all my conversations with people. Overall employment now hovers around 42%, and it has been higher, while for young people between 15 and 29 years, it stands at least at 60%. At least 70% of the population receives international assistance, humanitarian assistance, without which they could not meet their basic needs. Personal need is everywhere. But what is new in my long experience in Gaza is the sense of desperation, which can be felt in the different ways that people behave and respond, and the boundaries they are willing to cross that once were inviolate. Such behavior is not hidden, but in full view, an emerging feature of daily life. In one painful example, a well-appointed woman, her face fully covered by a niqab, came to the Marna House Hotel where I was staying, and she came to beg. When politely asked to leave by the hotel staff, she aggressively refused and insisted on staying, raising her voice in anger, obliging the hotel staff to forcefully remove her from the premises. She clearly was not asking to stay and beg, but demanding to do so. I've never seen this before in Gaza. In another instance, also at the Marna House, I was sitting with a colleague in the hotel restaurant when a boy, a teenager with acne on his face, came to our table quietly pleading for money for his family. By the time I reached for my wallet, the wait staff had approached and gently ushered him out of the restaurant, and he did not resist, unlike the woman in the niqab. This young boy was well-dressed and clearly very well-educated, and I kept thinking he should be at home studying for an exam or out with his friends by the sea. Instead, he was begging and humiliated, asked to leave the hotel and never return. Perhaps the most alarming indicator of people's desperation is the growth of prostitution in Gaza's traditional and conservative society. Although prostitution has always been present to varying but very limited degrees in Gaza, it was always considered shameful and immoral, carrying immense social consequences for the woman and her family. This appears to be changing as individual and family resources dissolve. A colleague who is a well-known and highly respected professional in Gaza told me that women, many of them well-dressed, have come to his office soliciting him, and, quote, not for a lot of money, end quote. He also told me that because of the rise of prostitution, it has become harder for girls to get married because, quote, no one knows who is pure, end quote. Families also plead with him to provide a safe and decent space for their daughters by employing them in his office. Another friend told me, while sitting in a restaurant, he witnessed a young woman trying to solicit a man with her parents at a nearby table. When I asked him how he explained such incomprehensible behavior, he responded by saying, people who live in a normal environment behave normally. People who live in an abnormal environment do not. Abnormality in Gaza is also seen in rising suicide rates, from hanging, immolation, jumping from heights, drug overdose, ingestion of pesticides, and firearms. Gaza's divorce rate, historically low at 2%, now approaches 40%. According to the UN and local healthcare professionals. In fact, I had a conversation with a friend in Gaza just 2 days ago, and he was telling me that a friend and colleague of his, who's a judge in the Sharia courts in Gaza, told him that in one day he had 29 cases of divorce, which was a peak for him. There are 2,000 domestic disputes a month in Shatay camps, said one under official, and the police cannot cope. The courts alone receive hundreds of complaints every month. The Hamas government cannot deal with the number of problems, and around 40% of Gaza's youth want to emigrate. One must also remember that almost 3/4 of Gaza's approximately 2 million people is 29 years old and younger and remains confined to Gaza, prohibited from leaving the territory, and most never have. Amid such disempowerment, young people have increasingly turned towards militancy as a livelihood, joining different militant and extremist organizations simply to secure a paying job. Person after person argued that growing support for extremist factions in Gaza does not emanate from political or ideological belief, although that is true for certain people, but from the need to feed their families. One colleague, himself a religious Muslim, argued to me, quote, "If the Israelis were smart, they would open 2 or 3 industrial zones, do a security check, and find the most wanted among us and employ them. Al-Qassam would evaporate very quickly and everyone would be more secure. There is a difference," he said, "between what is said in the mosque and what people would settle for. I tell you, the mosques would be empty," end quote. I repeatedly heard about former Al-Qassam fighters who left the organization when they obtained new homes in one of Gaza's housing projects, not wanting to risk the security of their home as a possible Israeli target. In a similar vein, a local businessman told me, quote, "What we need is Israeli factories in Palestinian hands. 1 sack of cement employs 35 people in Gaza. With 1 worker in Israel, you have 7 people in Gaza praying for Israel's security." Imagine a made in Gaza brand. We could market regionally and it would sell like hotcakes. Gaza would benefit and so would Israel. All we want are open borders for export, end quote. To be rich in Gaza. Amid Gaza's misery and impoverishment lies a striking contrast, an inconsistency, as it were. Gaza's privileged. This sector is tiny, and the number I kept hearing was 50,000, but highly visible. For some, their wealth derives from the now almost defunct tunnel trade, which once kept Gaza's economy functioning, even thriving, albeit artificially under Israel's damaging closure. The existence of this minuscule sector of affluence is sometimes used to argue that conditions in Gaza are much better than portrayed. The privileged, historically vital to local production, are consumers of goods, since relatively little is produced in Gaza right now. They, together with a fluctuating tourism sector, fill Gaza's hotels, shopping malls, and restaurants that have grown in response to their demand. I call it the Gaza bubble. Others call it a welcome sign of normalcy. One human rights worker told me that the fastest growing business in Gaza City today is restaurants, because they are one of the few profitable activities left in the Strip. The pervasive consumerism that characterizes the prosperous in Gaza is certainly not specific to the territory, and nor is the great disparity in class and scale. Of course, people should not be denied the right to consume whatever they want. Yet, like the vast majority of Gazans, the affluent are also confined and beleaguered, enraged and demeaned by their inability to live freely and with any real semblance of predictability. One of Gaza's richest and most successful businessmen spent an evening with me pouring out his frustration and describing in painstaking detail the restrictions imposed on his business by Israel, which used to be an essential market. Quote, "The Israelis are destroying my business, my ability to work, and why? They squeeze, 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 towards what end? Where will this bring all of us?" End quote. Others were present at this evening, all of them members of Gaza's social and economic elite, and no one could see a way out. The evening alternated between exasperation and silence, always ending in irresolution. Yet my friend's disgrace, and fundamentally that is what it is, does not derive from any sense of defeat, but from the knowledge that no amount of reason, law, or morality has had or will have any impact on their situation. To the contrary, appeals based on fairness, principle, or rationality have only brought them more destruction. Those who are considered privileged in Gaza are not necessarily people with a great deal of money. They are also people with a source of income. There are those who do what they can to help others. But amid the despair that now permeates Gaza, charity is no longer a simple, unencumbered act of giving. It is burdened with a set of expectations and demands that can never be satisfied. A dear friend of mine from a prominent Gaza family described his dilemma. Quote, "After paying my taxes to Hamas, new fees springing up all the time, household expenses, food, and helping friends, I am depleting my personal funds. Soon I will have to sell some assets just to pay my bills. Yes, I am much better off than most people here, and I do what I can to help others, but where does it stop? The tragedy of this situation," he said, "is that friends look at you as a source of money. And friendships end when you can no longer provide that money. Think of what it takes to make people behave in this way. No one seems to be considering the pressure it takes to change one's core values. This is what we have been reduced to. This was never Gaza." Now I want to briefly read from a section called Questioning Hamas and God, which I found to be one of the most interesting findings from my trip. And there's a whole section here on Hamas, which I'm not going to read, but be happy to discuss during the Q&A. There is also in Gaza a struggle to create a normal society. There always has been. Some people, no doubt more than I realize, have not abandoned possibility and creative resistance. They see scarcity as a catalyst for change, and their work assumes a variety of forms. One uses religion to re-examine social behavior and to critique it. This is altogether new in Gaza, and it is quite stunning. Although the trend among some in Gaza is to turn to religion as a refuge, there has emerged a counter-trend that also seeks refuge of another sort. This is how it was explained to me, and admittedly, I did not have the time on this trip to examine this claim more deeply. The misconduct and fraudulence that is now associated with Hamas and the inability to challenge it in any meaningful and effective manner have given rise to a social commentary on and even critique of Hamas's conduct that uses religion as its analytical instrument. This critique is not about conditions of life in Gaza, but about the use of religion by Hamas as a coercive tool and justification for abusive behavior. By linking political behavior to religion and using religion to judge the defects in that behavior, people are, quoting a colleague, putting power on the defensive, end quote, in an altogether unprecedented way, at least in Gaza. This critique is taking place entirely on social media, Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, beyond the control of Hamas, which is apparently very frustrated by its inability to control or extinguish the increasingly harsh commentary. According to my sources, the social media phenomenon reaches tens of thousands of followers. For example, I heard about a story of a cow and the brutal, unconscionable way the animal was slaughtered. The cow's cruel treatment apparently became an internet sensation viewed by thousands. While some people justified the slaughter in the name of Islam, others railed against it, asking, "Is this Islam? Why are we behaving like this?" A vibrant exchange apparently followed. The critique, my respondents argued, is all the more astonishing because it is not confined to a religious critique of Hamas alone, but increasingly and carefully includes the idea of Islam and God as well. The emerging questioning of religion and God, an incendiary act by any measure in the Middle East, represents a potential earthquake in the Islamic world, and there I am quoting another friend. And it continues to grow. Given the enormous risks associated with even engaging in such a discourse, to do so is a courageous act, and one, in my view, that speaks powerfully to the non-existence of other viable and acceptable options, and it certainly bears watching. I'm concluding now. Gaza, too, is home to other forms of creative thinking and rebuilding, a burgeoning of cultural production, art, theater, photography, and music, and volunteerism among the young is apparently growing. A range of initiatives has emerged that attempt in their own way to address Gaza's predicament. Without a guiding and functioning central authority, these efforts are by nature self-contained and confined. Still, they remain persistent and vibrant. They include the renewal of small-scale agriculture, human rights monitoring, mental health rehabilitation and trauma and research into trauma, environmental repair, and technological innovation. The last was strongly emphasized. Gaza has a highly talented, tech-savvy population. If ever there were peace, an American investor stated, Gaza's internet sector would become another India, end quote. The number of internet users in Gaza is reportedly equal to that of Tel Aviv, and a limited number are already subcontracting for companies in India, Bangladesh, and in Israel. The constraining factor in Gaza has never been insufficient talent. So here are my concluding remarks. Perhaps the most striking feature of life in Gaza is attenuation, a narrowing of space and the certainty of that space as a place to live, and a narrowing of desire, expectation, and vision. Given the immense difficulties of everyday life, the particular and the mundane, having enough food, water, electricity, or clothing, have been elevated to an aspiration. Concerns have been paired, as have yearnings. They have become inward-looking and confined, focused understandably on self and family. When a friend of mine asked some of his students, "What is your wish?" they answered, "A new pair of pants, a new shirt, and ice cream from the shop on Omar al-Mukhtar Street. The craving is not for a homeland, and the fear is not its absence. The craving is for a livelihood, no matter how meager, clean water, and sanctuary, and the fear is that they are unattainable. Within such incarceration, there is simply no place for dreams. Why dream, someone said, when opportunities do not exist and cannot be created? Why plan when there is little, if any, possibility of realizing those plans? And why even resist when it is unclear who should be resisted, who will benefit, and what it will achieve? So how then does one even begin to think about the greater good of moving forward as a society, a feature that was so defining during the First Intifada, which too many young people in Gaza know little, if anything, about? In fact, I was struck by how little young but well-educated adults I met knew of the First Intifada and the Oslo years, and how acutely young Palestinians in Gaza are embedded in the present day. In this way, not only are they disconnected from their future, they are also disconnected from their very recent past and the many important and now apparently lost lessons contained within it. My friend, the professional I mentioned earlier, said, "People are afraid to enter the world, or they enter it defensively with weapons. Our openness to the world is narrowing more and more, and people are afraid of leaving Gaza because they do not know how to cope with the world outside, like a prisoner who has been released from prison after years of confinement. People must be taught to think more broadly, otherwise we are lost." What do the Israelis want? This question was repeatedly asked, with each questioner looking at me searchingly, even imploringly, for an answer, for some insight they clearly felt they did not have. Stated a colleague in his early 50s, "If the Israelis were thinking everyone could benefit, all they must do is give us a window to live a normal life, and all these extremist groups would disappear. Our generation wants to make peace, and it is foolish for Israel to refuse, because the next generation may not be as willing." During the first 6 months of 2016, the Ministry of Interior reported that 24,138 babies were born in the Gaza Strip, averaging 132 babies per day. During the month of August 2016 alone, 4,961 babies were born in Gaza, or 160 babies per day, over 6 babies every hour, and 1 baby every 9 minutes. The distance between Gaza City and Tel Aviv is 44 miles. "What will Israel do," asked a friend, "when there are 5 million Palestinians living in Gaza?" Thank you.
Thank you, Feda, Lawrence, and Sarah, for a most compelling presentations. It definitely raises great many questions for me, whether and why would the international community shirk its responsibility towards the status of Jerusalem, or why would BDS would engender such enmity and belligerence at the state level, even in the state like Maryland and places on Congress, or the most sobering presentation on Gaza, which probably will call us up listening to what you had to say, Sarah. I like what you said about the scarcity as a catalyst for change. It's a very dynamic thing. It's expressive of the situation in Gaza. I promise you I will not ask any questions, though. So, and I promise you to take as many questions as possible with your permission, all of you, because being the last session, we can go a little bit over. Right, Dr. Subhi? We will do that. So, and Sam preemptively raised his hand early on, so I'm going to give you the first question, Sam. Go ahead. Yes.
Preemptive is one of the words that I dislike in other contexts.
Well, you must.
To the ambassador, why have you not yet invoked the Uniting for Peace resolution in order to get Palestine admitted as a full-fledged member state in the United Nations by the UN General Assembly?
Thank you for that question. So we have invoked Uniting for Peace for many other reasons, including in the context of the 10th Emergency Special Session since 1997. to actually address Israel's actions in East Jerusalem and the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory. The fact is that Uniting for Peace cannot secure full membership. The charter would have to be changed.
The UN Charter?
The UN Charter would have to be changed. The only way that membership can be secured is by a recommendation from the Security Council to the General Assembly. This is as per charter rules. Uniting for Peace involves actions that are a threat to international peace and security, wherein the Security Council fails its responsibilities. And repeatedly, we have gone to Uniting for Peace to address what we deem as actions threatening international peace and security, and even threatening the existence of our people, which is what that was the path that we actually took to get to the International Court of Justice regarding the wall, because we saw what the wall was from the very first slab of cement that was put down. We went to the Security Council, the doors were closed. We then went to the emergency special session of the General Assembly, the Uniting for Peace mechanism, that eventually led us to the ICJ. But on the issue of full membership, there is no other way. We have explored every option, and there is no other path other than through the Security Council to the General Assembly. And as everyone knows, the US veto in the Security Council makes it improbable that we would be able to achieve that.
The PAA and or the PLO would...
Yeah.
Okay, right there.
Because you don't want to, right there.
Oh, Mark Harrison. That question made me want to ask another question, but I won't ask that question. My question is to Sara Roy. Thank you for your presentation, all right? But I want to go back to a previous discussion we had earlier. When your report comes out, what implications are going to fall on you at Harvard University? Who is going to attack you? What's going to affect your, quote, will you be able to rise up through the academic structure? And you know you have one of the most vehement persons in the School of Law at Harvard University who comes down hard on people. So that's the first question. The other one is a request. I would love for you to write a letter to Senator Markey to have a sit-down conversation with him about your experience and what you saw. Because he won't be able to say, I don't know.
Okay. First of all, is this on? Yeah, you can hear me? Okay. First of all, I think you're referring to Alan, Professor Dershowitz, and he's retired and living in New York City now. Yeah, I don't think this is on, actually. It is? Okay. But
that does not prevent him from
No,
attacking you.
it doesn't prevent it. But honestly, I can tell you honestly that while there are difficulties, certainly, working on this issue in the United States, in the academy and outside the academy, my experiences, generally speaking, and at Harvard, have over the years gotten increasingly easier. I'm not saying they're easy, but the space has widened considerably for discourse on this issue. And there isn't this cone of silence that used to exist many, many, many years ago. And yes, there is still opposition, yes, there's still attacks, but overall, it is now considered a legitimate act to express criticism of Israel, of Israeli policies, in seminars and conferences. And the university has promoted, obviously those of us working within it, we've pushed very hard to engage a spectrum of opinion over the years, and not just one. and to give students and members of the community more than one way to understand this conflict. And I think we've been pretty successful. There are attacks, and there's always going to be attacks, but it's not as arduous an activity as it used to be. And also there are people at the university who speak out more forcefully on this issue, and there isn't this feeling that by doing so you are automatically going to be fired or let go. That can happen, it most certainly still does, but it's not as axiomatic as it used to be.
All right, thank you. Okay, yeah.
Thank you for the opportunity. My question goes to Dr. Lawrence, please, about the BDS. I live in Maryland, and we defeated the anti-BDS 2 times locally. But unfortunately and shamefully, our governor, Larry Hogan, just signed an executive order, and he calls it Strengthening Maryland Opposition to BDS Movement Against Israel, which means any company that supports BDS will not have a government contract. Then, shamefully again, my senator, Ben Cardin, with the support of Congressman Sarbanes and John Delaney, which is my congressman, introducing a bill. It's called S-720, and this is anti-BDS bill, which means, I believe, not just businesses, maybe individuals, if they are convicted of supporting BDS, which is me, myself, and anybody in this room, will be jailed for 20 years and be fined up to $1 million. We confronted with senators. We're doing another rally tomorrow. We spoke to Sarbanes, but we need more help. Thank you.
Please.
Yes, yes. I repeat that this sort of draconian response is a function of fear of the BDS's potential. These legislative moves are obviously unconstitutional. And so I think that ultimately they will either not, the ACLU will come in and together with other groups force these bills to be retracted, or they won't pass, or if they've come up and passed, they will be challenged, and ultimately they will be judged unconstitutional, as will the executive orders. That doesn't mean that the fear factor that they instill won't, isn't something we should take into consideration. They do instill fear. However, they also provide a platform for education and for the exposure of the Zionist project for what it is. So it's part of the struggle, this back and forth. Essentially, what's happened is when the Israelis took over Palestine, they exported the consequences of their own racism. Okay? And so now, throughout the world, you have examples of Israeli racism. And those examples have risen up. They've gotten allies. Okay? And I'm positive that, David Ben-Gurion or Chaim Weizmann or whoever never believed that in 70 years they would still be fighting this fight. Okay? So in many ways, they exported with the Palestinians their own crimes, examples of their own crimes, and this has led to the continuing struggle. I don't think you should stop, and I'm sure you won't, in your opposition because of this fear factor. And I'm pretty sure, of course, the good guys don't always win, but I am pretty sure that these anti-BDS offerings are utterly unconstitutional, and I think even with Trump's people on the court, you're going to get that kind of ruling. And if we don't, then we'll all go to Canada.
Sarah?
I just want to also say in that regard, I think it's important to frame these discussions in terms that resonate with Americans. And that is, frame them in terms of, or compare them to the civil rights movement, for example, in this country. And use frameworks that Americans can relate to, that are drawn from their own history, where boycotts were used and other methods were used. That's much harder to push back against.
Yeah, I mean, I want, if I may, I want to ask you how you deal with intimidation, because you mentioned the Israeli politician who basically threatened to assassinate BDS activists and so on. And we've seen this down in Texas that was in the path of Harvey. They conditioned aid on the fact that you sign a document said you don't support BDS. So it is really full-blown.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with that?
Personally?
I mean, personally or as a movement, or collectively?
No. I mean, as a movement, you don't let it intimidate you, and you do what Sara Roy suggests. You draw those kind of comparisons, and you ask the senator, does he want to be on the side of racists or not? And if he thinks that that's an unreasonable question, I'm sure we can catch him on film, just like this guy. Pence. I mean, you can't be afraid of, I mean, you can, but I have never allowed myself to be personally to be intimidated by any of this. I just do what I do, and they shoot or they don't shoot. I mean, I'm still here.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Dina Modiano Fox, and I'm not sure that this question is really for this panel, but I've been itching to ask it all day, so excuse me if it isn't. I was wondering if perhaps you, Ambassador, more than the others, could tell us whether the situation in Lebanon, as it is now, the uncertainty, plays in the Palestinian issue.
What an easy question.
It's quite complicated. I would say that any volatility and instability in the region ultimately affects Palestine and the people of Palestine who are scattered throughout the region. So if we look at Lebanon directly, we can begin, as Professor Roy mentioned, from the ground up. We have almost 500,000 Palestinians in refugee camps in Lebanon. The stability of that country, or rather further destabilization of that country, would affect their conditions, which are already desperate and impoverished and marginalized and insecure. Beyond that, should there be a conflagration in southern Lebanon, for example, between Hezbollah and Israel, of course, any unraveling or destabilization in the region inevitably affects Palestine, whether in terms of the impact on the population, on people, or on political maneuvering, the kind of attention that we can get to the plight of our people, whether in the UN or in the corridors of Washington or elsewhere. It most definitely does. Yes.
Okay, please. Maybe a couple more questions.
This is for Dr. Roy. Does Hamas provide services like the Muslim Brotherhood, like education or clinics? And if they do, how is that received by the Gazan people?
Well, it depends. It depends what period of time you're talking about. I mean, there was a point. There are different phases. At one phase, before Hamas assumed control of Gaza, through their social service sector, they provided a range of services. And they weren't, again, this wasn't the dominant source of service in Gaza, but it was an important one, and one that was of relatively high quality overall. And again, I'm oversimplifying this. With the assumption of power in 2007 and the change in the political situation, those institutions continued, of course, to provide services. Now Hamas was in charge of governmental services, and their performance there over time deteriorated. And that is due to a variety of factors that are both internal and external. But there was great disaffection by the population. This is one thing I didn't get into with Hamas and their performance, and it had a lot to do with not only with the political situation, but the inability to mitigate in any manner the socioeconomic conditions in the territory. And that's, I think, one reason among many that Hamas felt the pressure of entering into this so-called reconciliation with the Palestinian Authority. But again, that's gross oversimplification of a much more complex situation.
Okay. With that, I want to thank you all for profound presentations, and I really want to thank those who organized this conference. Give them a round of applause, and thank you, Dr. Siddiq.
Thank you, Saeed. Supposedly we have 15 minutes for closing remarks, but there'll be way much less than that. I think that you have been a fantastic audience over the last 6 hours. And with that, I really want to thank the audience for the questions, the attention, and I hope that the theme of this meeting today was the Palestinian question, adversity on all fronts. I really think that you have seen the adversity and what is there. I do want to thank the program committee. I want to thank the staff that has done an excellent job in putting this together. I do want to thank the panelists and the moderators. And I hope that we did present thought-provoking discussions. You have seen that from the first panel to the issues enunciated in the last panel. This was the mission for this meeting. I think that we have succeeded in doing that, and everything is on the internet, everything is on our website that you have seen today. Within 1 week, we will have the transcripts of everything you heard today, as well as the videos. So you can refer to it 1 week, 1 month, and 1 year from now. Thank you again, and God bless you all. Thank you.